Yang's freedom, what he calls the freedom dividend, is commonly referred to as UBI, which is universal basic income. The idea is to give each individual $1,000 a month for the rest of their lives. And for some people, you know, there's probably not a huge deal, but for a lot of people, and I think for the majority of Americans, maybe even 70% or 75% of Americans, this could make a huge difference. The people I think it makes a huge difference for are the people who have to worry about paying rent every month, or maybe like, you know, a couple hundred short in rent every month. Those I think are the people that will have a huge impact on. And I think that's the majority of Americans, if not like 75% of Americans. And what gets me excited about that, the freedom dividend, and I think calling it freedom dividend is just the perfect name for it, is because this whole idea, and you know, I think he's the only candidate talking about this idea of abundance. So changing people's mindset from scarcity to abundance, I think, is what gets me really excited about the freedom dividend, the idea of the freedom dividend. Because when you have people worrying about how they're going to pay for their rent every month, they don't have the brain capacity or even the soul capacity to think about the bigger problems of the world, like climate change, for example. They're too focused on their day-to-day lives, and you know, too focused on dealing with their own issues, that they don't have the capacity to think of anything beyond their own issues. And that's so understandable, and that's why you have Trump, and that's why you have, like, you know, certain media outlets getting away with spreading disinformation, because no one cares, you know, no one cares, people are disengaged because they're so focused on their day-to-day lives, trying to make rent and all that stuff. But once you kind of free people of that, then, you know, maybe they have the capacity to think bigger than their own specific lives and their own issues. And so I think when you have that, that's when it's really interesting. And then there's also specific case studies that are interesting too. Think about abusive relationships. You know, particularly women in abusive relationships that are stay at home and not making income. So a big fear of that is, you know, how do you leave this abusive relationship if you don't have the money? But if you had $1,000, that could make a huge difference. So there's a lot of like these little case studies that, you know, when you really think about it, it's like, wow, this idea of giving people $1,000 a month could be very revolutionary. And what I'm really excited to see is what becomes of this. You know, you do something like this, and then you don't even know, like, all the things that could happen, you know, that could grow from this very simple idea. Of course, you know, you're going to get people who are addicted to drugs, who are going to use the money to buy drugs. That's going to be a small segment, but we can't let that idea or that small segment ruin this larger experiment that I think could be revolutionary and could make a real difference. But the reason why, you know, I didn't really want to talk about UBI is that you know, the knock against Yang is that he's a one sort of trick pony, and that's so far from the truth. Like I said earlier, he's been campaigning since 2007, or he threw his hat in the ring since 2017, summer 2017. He's had a lot of time to think about this, and he threw his hat, you know, he ran for presidency for all the right reasons. He wants to solve the big problems that he is seeing, and that's the only reason why he's running for president. He has no real desire, no egoic desire to be president, but to him, time is running out, and the fastest way for him to solve these issues is to run for president, and that's why he's doing it. And so if you look, if you bother to go onto his page and you look at his platform, he actually has over 100 solutions to big and very small issues, and it's broken up into kind of like 3 areas, and they all kind of coalesce into this whole idea of human first. So again, I really don't hesitate to get into the weeds of the policies, but just to highlight a couple policies that I think is really smart, really interesting, that highlights his way of thinking, which to me is more important. One idea is the democracy dollars. And again, they get his ideas sometimes get made fun of because they seem like these silly ideas, but when you really think about it, it's almost they're pretty revolutionary. So democracy dollars is giving each citizen $100, right? And they can only spend the $100 towards contributing to a campaign that they believe in. So you can only use this money to donate to a campaign, which is really smart because that's a great way of combating, a really smart market way of combating big money, which is a huge issue in our elections, is that big corporate donors buying out these candidates. So democracy dollars goes a long way towards solving that. Of course he's for overturning Citizens United and all of that and getting big money out, but he's the only one really coming up with interesting creative ideas to figure out how we kind of manage that in the meantime. So that's what I really love about Andrew Yang, is that he's not about pointing out what the problem is and that's it. He's not about like screaming about the problem. Some of these politicians, they just scream about the problems, and I think they have more of a scarcity mindset where they're just like, let's punish this group of people, we gotta punish this group of people, we gotta punish that group of people. Andrew Yang is not about that. He's about how do we solve issues so we help everybody. He's not about trying to punish any group of people. He's just all about like figuring out the best solution, and that's what I like about him. And then the other thing that I want to touch on just a little bit is he wants to change the way we measure GDP, or do away with GDP. GDP, gross domestic product, is how we've been measuring our progress for decades and decades. And even the guy who came up with GDP said it was a very poor way of measuring progress. And so what Yang wants to do is inject other measurements of well-being into how we measure our progress as a nation. Things like when a mom or dad stays at home to care for their child, that is a benefit to society, not a cost. Right now, the way we measure GDP, that's not even included. And so he wants to include those things. And then he talks about how education, 60% of effect on a child's education is actually in the home. It's actually their home environment. That's what has an impact on a child's education. So right now, when we look at education, we're just solely focused on, giving money to schools, but that's only tackling 30% of the issue. You know, how do we tackle the rest? And you know, things like the UBI goes towards doing that. So yeah, so it's just an interesting. He says it, I think he calls it like human. Well, the whole idea is like this human first idea, putting human first, and very human centric way of looking at our economic measures, our measures of how our nation is doing, and all of that. So